Begin, and Karen, would you start the recording, please?
Yes.
This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on the SIETAR USA website. I'd like to say good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining the December webinar of the Society for Intercultural Education, Training, and Research USA. We definitely appreciate your interest and your time. I'm Sandy Fowler, president of SIETAR USA. Few logistics. We do have a chat room, of course, and if you have a question of clarity or something of that sort, please put that into the chat room. I can let Miguel know that he has a question, but we will have time at the end for questions and answers where we can all join in. I'd like to say now that it is with great pleasure that I introduce your speaker for today. I first met Miguel Gandert. He was the opening speaker. He was a keynote speaker at the SIETAR conference in Albuquerque, which we figure must have been 2007, because in 2008 he was also the keynote speaker for the international conference in Granada. After that, because I liked his photography so much, I actually placed his images on the cover of the American Psychologist in 2009. And as a result of that, I interviewed him and wrote an essay to accompany the art, and felt like I got to know him a little bit. He has credentials probably several miles long, and it's always difficult under those circumstances to figure out what to say. I did find two things that I think are interesting, and I could. The first is his photography career began in high school. He was taking pictures for his yearbook, and he knew even then that something that he wanted to do for the rest of his life was to continue to take pictures. And the reason for that is that my grandson also took pictures for his yearbook in high school, and he now takes wonderful pictures on his hiking trips, but he's in third year law and going in a different direction. Miguel's pictures, the photography is in numerous public collections, including the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and many, many others. The other thing that I wanted to say about Miguel is that during his student years, he had two important mentors. One was Beaumont Newhall, who is the director of the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York, and that happens to be where I grew up. And so I had visited the George Eastman House many times, but I never thought about how it could be and was for many people a source of inspiration and learning about photography. The other thing, his other mentor was Tony Hillerman, who helped him develop his journalism skills, and Tony Hillerman happens to be one of my favorite authors. So with that, I will say Miguel is a distinguished professor emeritus of communication and journalism at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in photography, multimedia journalism, ethnography, media theory, and intercultural communication. So his talk today is Nuevo Mexico Midwinter Celebrations at the Intercultural Symbiosis. And he will also add a re-examination of the tricultural myth. And I am looking forward to hearing anything you have to say, Miguel. You're up.
Thank you, and thank all of you who are here with me. Sort of to get started, I've actually had so many good mentors. Jack Condon, who brought me into the intercultural communication field, Edward T. Hall, who lived in Santa Fe, who I knew very well, a guy named J.B. Jackson, who invented the field of cultural geography, and I got to work with in the 80s. I'm one of these people who doesn't have a PhD, became a distinguished professor, and it was because my graduate school was working with incredible people in the field, to give all of those people credit. But especially Jack Condon, who's a really important friend and colleague, and we taught together for 7 years before he retired. But to begin this talk, I want to put a few things in context. In 1912, New Mexico became a state in 1912. Over 50 years after California became a state. Last time I looked, we're closer to Washington, D.C. than California. And part of the reason New Mexico, which at the time actually made up all of New Mexico and Arizona, some of southern Colorado, was cut in half because they had a problem with New Mexico that they didn't have in California, and which is why we remained a territory till 1912. And this is just to give you a little context to what we're going to look at and what we're going to be talking about. And the real difficult part of this was the reason that we stayed a territory is there were too many Mexicans here and too many Indians here. And so they cut New Mexico and Arizona in half, essentially to get closer to where a white majority could remain in power in the region. And the other problem with having too many Mexicans and Indians is this whole problem with what we now call miscegenation, this fear that that was in the sciences, where you wouldn't study cultural hybridity because it was deemed impure. And of course, the fear of cross-pollination, to say a polite way, of the races. And so in New Mexico, to become a state, they built what I call the tricultural myth. And it's a pretty commonly used term here. And it was the community where Native Americans, Spanish, and white people lived separately but in harmony. And that was to convince that this miscegenation and polluting of the white culture wasn't going to happen. Well, we all know, especially as interculturalists, it's much more complicated when you're not your neighbors. And one of the things that's always interested me, and when I first started working in the intercultural field, is I always found the most interesting things happen on the margins, on the places where we look at cultural collisions. It's that contact that is so important. And for New Mexico, that has been part of our legacy. In 2007, suddenly the tricultural myth exploded. A scholar who was the state historian at the time, God, why did my name just go blank? Esteban Real Galvez, who is from northern New Mexico, wrote a memorial bill to the Santa Fe legislature. And we'll get more into this in a little, but it's sort of a context for what we're going to be looking at. And there was a term found in northern New Mexico, which was the term genízaro. And genízaro were Hispanicized and detribalized Indians and slaves. And so as we look at this context, well, now that we have all this DNA testing, they find that 70% of Native New Mexicans, those people that were deemed to be Spanish in 1912, are actually have some genízaro blood, if not a lot, myself included. And so we're going to talk about that. But the thing that's important for me is I'm always looking at symbols and rituals. And so I'm going to disappear myself here because I'd rather look at my pictures too. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to go southern part of New Mexico, right near the border to start. Okay, the major feast day, and one that I will be participating in next Thursday, is December 12th, which is the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And this is a picture from a place called Tortugas, which is a Hispanic barrio in Las Cruces. And technically, because of the way American law works, they consider themselves a pueblo, but they have no papers. They have no, they don't benefit from, what do you say? They don't benefit from, I hate to use the term, but it's so relevant, is apartheid that happens in the US with you know, native homelands. But they consider themselves, at least for the 2 days of the year that they're celebrating Our Lady of Guadalupe, to not be Hispanic, but to be a Native American Pueblo. And there's 3 different dance groups there. This is the church in Tortugas. And this is a group that when you look at them, you see what really looks like a very typical Pueblo dance. But these are not Indians. They're really probably more than likely descendants of Hispanicized and detribalized slaves. And they're dancing, and they're the oldest group in Tortugas. And their history in a very indirect way goes back to 1690, the Pueblo Revolt, where a pueblo just south of Albuquerque called Isleta, half of the Indians from Isleta left, started a new pueblo just southeast of Las Cruces called Isleta del Sur, where they have a casino at Isleta up here at 7 lucky minutes south on I-25, as they say. But the people in Tortugas learned their dance from Isleta del Sur, and they actually acknowledge that connection. And you can see it's very typical: moccasins, bow and arrow noisemakers, rattles, but all of the commands are in Spanish. And this is the oldest group in Tortugas. They also do a dance that we'll talk a lot about called the Matachines, and these are Matachines. And they also do this. This is a dance that is danced both in Hispanic communities, or what we would consider typical Hispanic villages in northern New Mexico, as well as a number of pueblos. The leggings on these particular dancers are very much reminiscent of leggings at San Juan Pueblo, which is nearest to the site of the first Spanish-Mexican settlement in New Mexico. The dancers are extraordinary. They have a number of characters in the dance. In this particular dance, they play the fiddle. It's kind of a polka that they dance to. The little girls are what are called Malinches. You'll notice they have Indian face paint on them. The Malinche is a very controversial figure in Mexico. Historically, Malinche was the translator for Hernan Cortez when they conquered Mexico. She was very good at languages. So depending on how you look at her, she's considered the turncoat in Mexico. She allowed the use of her language skills to conquer Mexico. Other people, feminists in Mexico, consider her the first rape victim and a victim of the symbolic rape of the Indian people. And then there's the third alternative, which is the New Mexican alternative. She's always presented as a girl in white, very, very similar to First Holy Communion in the Catholic Church clothing. And she's considered the mother of the new race, the mixed people that are primarily, you know, the idea of Mexico. They do a number of dances that they share with the northern pueblos, especially. This particular dance is like maypole dance, where they braid those ribbons. I've also seen this dance at Picuris Pueblo, which is an indigenous community between Santa Fe and Taos. And it's really quite a spectacular dance. They're linked to those Indian dancers as the oldest dance at Tortugas. Very traditional European instruments. And this becomes really important when we think about how culture is transmitted. I'll be at Jemez Pueblo on the 12th. And one of the things that's really interesting about Jemez is they're actually a tricultural Matachines celebration. And it's a kind of an odd thing, but they have two different groups. One group that comes out of the Catholic Church, and the music is violins and guitars. And the second group that comes out of the Kiva, and there it's drums and vocables, which is really, really different from the thing. But the odd thing is the ones that come out of the church, the commands are in Spanish, and the ones that come out of the Kiva, the language is Caris. Well, Jemez is not a Caris speaking pueblo, and so you go, why? I can understand from the Catholic Church why they're coming out in Spanish. I don't understand why the ones that come out of the Kiva are speaking Caris instead of Tiwa, the language of Jemez Pueblo. And the reason why is the Spanish variation of the dance and the music was learned from the Mexican communities, Spanish Mexican communities in northern New Mexico. And they learned the other version from Cochiti Pueblo, which is a neighboring pueblo that speaks Caris, not the language of Jemez. So all of these symbols become really interesting, especially when we start thinking more. The second,
Miguel?
Yeah.
Miguel, I'm going to interrupt for just a second. You
Sure.
didn't turn off your video, so we do see you. And on some images, you're covering up a bit of the art. Much as
I thought I did. This didn't hide thumbnail video. I hit it.
Down on the bottom where Sumiko was saying that Maria should look, there's a video camera, little video camera, and it
Okay, I see it. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I thought I just had to hit this other thing. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Let me go back. I can just show some of the things that I might have been covering. I don't want to be covering. Okay, here we go. The third and fourth group separated, and they came up in the 1920s. And they're called La Danza Azteca de los Chichimecas. And the Chichimecas are the kind of the Comanches of northern state of Chihuahua, and they were really ferocious warriors. And they came up as migrants, and the grandfather of this guy brought the dance. This is General Pacheco, and they've been dancing since almost 100 years there. And they dress much more like Native Americans or Aztecs with huge feather headdresses and things. And there's another one of the pictures of the dancers, the Chichimecas. But they do a very, very similar dance. And one of the things that I always love is the fact that in some places, rituals that I've photographed have disappeared and gone over the last 30 years. Other places, they're strong, and there's a new generation coming up. Just want to show you this. This is a public art piece, or the maquette for it. One of my proudest public art pieces is it's outside of the Tortugas courtroom at the federal courthouse in Las Cruces, and it's about 5 feet tall and 15, 17 feet, I think, wide. And one of the fun things was when I was installing it, because I think one of the importance of things about art is getting a lot of community participation. And when I was putting it up in the courthouse, the staff, mostly the custodial staff, was watching, and they knew all the people and said, oh, I know that person and I know that person. And that was really pretty exciting, because the federal courthouse is not my favorite place. But one of my other favorite thing is now in that courthouse, this is where they swear in new citizens, primarily Mexicans, in front of my mural. Okay, just to show how this is really intercultural, one of the things when I did a book called Nuevo Mexico Profundo, I went out of my way to say how fluid culture is. And this is a feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Juarez, which is 50 miles from Las Cruces. And they celebrate on the same day. And they have many of the same characters in the dance. In all of these dances, and I hadn't really shown a picture yet and talked about, they have a figure called the abuelos, and they're kind of based on Pueblo clowns. They wear masks, and they kind of keep order, and they're the only ones that get to violate from the choreography of the dance. And they love photographers in Mexico. They do. But they're very much, the idea of Genízaro is really strong. They're Matachines. They're dancing, and their dancers are Apaches instead of Comanches. We'll talk about Comanche dance in New Mexico in a little bit. There's some more abuelos. This is the front of the church in the Basilica in Juarez, which of course is dedicated once again to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And she's a key figure, and I don't know how many people. There are two actual Lady of Guadalupes in the world. In Spain, she's a decked out, beaded out statue and an icon. And in the New World, she appears as an indigenous woman, often called La Moranita, the little brown one. And she appears the first time at a place called Tepeyac. And this is kind of important because that's the sacred mountain of the Aztecs and the Nahuatl people to the Earth Mother, whose name was Tonantzin. But Matachines are pretty much danced all over. I don't know this for a fact, but I like to sort of think about it. The oldest version of this dance, I'd like to imagine, came up with the Spanish-Mexican settlers who settled. And this is in a little village called Alcalde, which is closest to the first settlement by Spanish-Mexicans when they came up. And Alcalde is right next to what we call San Juan Pueblo. One of the cool things is all the pueblos are now changing their names back to the indigenous. So San Juan Pueblo is now called Oquehuengue. And this is the closest Matachines to Oquehuengue. There's an abuelo figure there. There's a couple of little bulls on the left-hand side of the frame. And this is the little Malinche converting the king, the rey, who's known as Montezuma, so that connection to Mexico is really strong, and she's converting him to Christianity. And this dance is really about symbols and stories and narratives. This is a Matachine. They usually don't like you to take pictures of their face because what they're wearing, they have a handkerchief around the lower half of their face. Their eyes are covered by that fringe. That hat's called a copil. It looks like an archbishop's hat. And so the dances, you're meant to be anonymous. But in his other hand is really the key two symbols to this dance. We have a trident, which is a Spanish word. It's called a palma, which is a Spanish word. And it represents three as one, which is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Sometimes the monarca or the Montezuma will have one with four, representing the four sacred directions. But the curious thing is a linguistic kind of intercultural idea is because palma is a Spanish word for the Christian symbol, and his other hand is a maraca, which is a Mexican rattle, but it's not called a maraca, which would be the Spanish term. It's called a waje. And a waje is, of course, a Native American term. And so we have his rattle, which is Native American and called that. And then we have his trident palma, which is representing Christianity, and it's called the Spanish word. In this drama in Alcalde, they dance in a bar. This is the bar called the Casanova. Great band called the Blue Ventures exists there. But they dance at night. They dance on the 26th of December, so it's part of the midwinter celebration. or midwinter dance cycle that happens both in Hispanic villages and Native American villages. You can see the Matachines in the background, but there's always a fight, a symbolic fight between the abuelo with his whip and the little bulls, the toro, who's from Spain, representing Spain. And usually the bull is gilded or castrated, and during the fight, which is sort of the submission of Spain to the Americas. But this is also another thing that happens in Alcalde. I'm working on a book now on Moors and Christian celebrations in the Americas. I've photographed Moors and Christian celebrations in Ecuador, Nicaragua, and 5 different villages in Spain. And this is New Mexico's version of it, one of the versions. They have a regular, more traditional Moors and Christians that ended in about 2004. And this one ended just 2 years ago. But this is the Comanches and the Españoles, the Comanches fighting the Spaniards. And this idea of Genízaro, this ritual is really important. The Comanche is an actual historic figure. His name was Cuerno Verde, Greenhorn, and there were actually 2 of them. His most famous quote is, "I always let the Mexicans and the Pueblos stay in their villages because I need somebody to tend to my crops and take care of my horses." And the Comanches, for a period of over 100 years, pretty much came into New Mexico and conquered in so many different ways. And then you have the guy with the conquistador helmet, and they do battle. But unlike Moors and Christians in all of the places I photographed them in the Americas, New Mexico's variation with this one is very different. They have a big battle at the end. Usually in other places, the battle is won by the Christians ultimately. And in this battle, they do a battle and then they both go off their own way. I once asked a guy named Galento Martinez, who was one of the organizers of this, and Galento told me the reason why is you don't want, and this gets back to that idea of Genízaro, you don't want your mother beating your father. The Pueblos do the dance as well, Matachines. This is,
Miguel?
Yeah.
Yeah. Before you go on, we do have a question for you.
Sure.
It's from Bridget, and she says, as a Black Caribbean woman, I am curious as to how you can say tricultural when I am mixed with so many cultures. Additionally, you've not mentioned the African influence in these cultures. And she asked, do you think this is an indicator of the level of racism that is blatant in Mexico?
That's actually a really good question. I retired from my faculty position in communication and journalism, and I now teach in Chicano studies. And one of the controversies we've had is we have a couple of Caribbean scholars. When I have Black students who ask me about the Black presence in New Mexico, these rituals are coming more out of an Anglophile place. The first contact with a European in New Mexico was a Black man. A lot of people don't realize it. His name was Estevanico. He was a historical figure who walked into Zuni Pueblo, was eventually murdered by them. But it is a problem. And we have a little bit of that problem, although we have a couple of our faculty in Chicano studies who are very much bringing to the forefront. And unfortunately, this isn't part of my scholarship to the degree, and the influence of it here has been not to the degree that it has in places like Veracruz, Mexico. We have a jaroche group that plays, and that's primarily music that comes from the Black influence of New Mexico. And I think she's absolutely right. It is about an inherent racism. When I'm looking at this longer historical thing, but it's really hard because that whole idea of miscegenation is such a strong defining point that if you had Black heritage, you denied it completely. And in a sense, Genízaro is acknowledging a different indigenous root here. And until relatively recently, that wasn't something people could be proud of. So, I think she's, absolutely right. Mexico denies its Black heritage, and yet it's there. I've done a lot of work in Bolivia, for example, and they're just beginning to acknowledge a Black heritage. There's a whole new subgroup of people who define themselves as Afro-Aymara. So they're speaking the traditional, and it's that kind of intercultural question that, what becomes really, really important is how we look at that place where things come together. Unfortunately, and in many ways in the New Mexico heritage, the degree of that early colonial influence of Blacks isn't here. The bigger influence that we had was primarily from the indigenous Mexicans, was the Nahuatl influence, with the Tlaxcalteca Indians, who were the Indians that helped Cortez essentially beat the Mexican, the Aztecs, because they were sworn mortal enemies. We have a lot of names here in New Mexico where they're that Nahuatl tradition, and I think it's really hard. It's really hard, and it's not just racist in Mexico to a certain degree. It's also racist in New Mexico to deny that Black heritage. But my colleagues are really trying to address that, and we're really trying to address it in kind of the curriculum of Chicano studies, and we've taken some heat for that. So I hope that answers the question. So I'll get back to this. This is a Matachines in Picuris Pueblo. So they dance on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And they have their version of the abuelo, and their version, there's their Malinche. And what's funny is a lot of Native American pueblos won't let you photograph their feast days. But at Picuris, they don't care if I photograph this, because they say, oh, that's that Mexican dance. And there's their bull, and you can see how much respect they have for the bull. This is Cat Sosi. And this is Christmas Eve at Picuris. And they dance no matter what. And it's icy, and they were dancing in a snowstorm. It's quite beautiful for Christmas Eve. But the other dance that's more controversial in New Mexico, and this is really the dance that is so important, is this is the group called Los Comanches del Serna. They're in Ranchos de Taos, not in Taos proper. And this is New Year's Day. They dance. And there's a guy taking a picture there with a little kid, and his mom is one of the dancers in there. And there's two shadows, and one of me and my colleague Enrique Lamadrid, who I've done several books with. We're there, and there's nobody else. This is sunrise. You can tell by the long shadows in front of the St. Francis of Assisi Church. And then there's a dog over in the right-hand side. And why do nobody here to watch them while there's 2,000, 3,000 people watching them dance at Taos Pueblo in the same day? It's because of that whole idea of miscegenation. But the Comanches has fundamentally become a key dance and an important dance in looking at New Mexico. These are descendants of Hispanicized and detribalized Indians. And how the Genízaros got status within New Mexico was they were given land grants, and they were given the most dangerous land in New Mexico. Almost all of the Genízaro communities were near places where the Comanches would come in. So Ranchos de Taos and Talpa, the community where these dancers are from, is right in the valley where the Comanches would come up to attack Taos. And so they were the first buffer. And almost all of the communities where you find these Comanche dances are in those kinds of buffers. And they're really quite extraordinary dances. there's been a lot of good new scholarship, or a new book that I'll talk about in a little bit, that's coming out today, actually. It's a pre-publication party. Talks about these dances and rituals. And these dances are called Comanches. They are primarily sung and just a drum, no Anglo instruments. But none of these people are what you would call legally Native American. These people are much more mixed race and would be considered Mexican, but they really have that Native American blood in them. One of my proudest things, this is a dance called the Espantada. It's a battle dance. You can see the guy in the back up in the air pretty high. But one of my proudest things is one of my former students, who I've known since he was a child. That's him dancing with his uncle. He's on the right. His name's, his name and title now is Dr. Gregorio Gonzalez. He just 2 years ago finished his PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. He did his undergrad and his master's degree at UNM. And Gregorio has written a dissertation, which I think will be really the first definitive Genízaro, major scholarly monograph. It's all his. He wouldn't even give me an essay for the book that I wrote because he's holding on to it. But it's really interesting. It's these native scholars that are identifying this ritual and really looking at the importance and kind of the ugly part of New Mexico history with slavery, and how slaves had to get status was literally to be fodder and buffer for the more dominant Spanish Mexican groups. But this dance, because nobody comes to see them dance in front of the church, they take the dance to different houses. They're dancing for what they call the Dia de los Manueles, Emmanuel, which is another name for Jesus. And so they go to the houses of anybody who's died during the year and anybody named Manuel, Manuelita, and they dance. This is the most important dance in terms of this ritual. It's called it's called Los Cautivos, the captive dance, because that's how Comanches would bring people into the community. They would capture you when populations were running low. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But they're really great feast days. The food's incredible. There's a drink in the early morning to keep you warm. I partake, I have to be honest. And then these are a couple of pictures from that ritual. I did a show at the Mexican Museum. It was a group show called the Real West Chicano Narrative Photography. And one of the things I realized, and these are meant to look a bit like the work of Edward Curtis, who you may be familiar with, who photographed all of the Indian tribes. Well, he was in New Mexico in 1907 and 1912. And we believe this dance, and we found, my colleague Enrique has found records going back over 150 years. And so we know when Curtis was there, he would have known about these Comanches, but he wouldn't have photographed them because they were Mexicans. And that whole idea of miscegenation and impurity would, in their minds and the anthropological mind, make them unworthy of study. So these are two of my favorite pictures. That's David Gonzalez and that's Linda Elena. But these dances are found in other places where you would have buffers against Native Americans. This is Abiquiu, about 150 yards from Georgia O'Keeffe's house. This is a dance called the Naneye. That's Floyd Trujillo in the front, and their kids, their captive children is part of the dance. And they dance on the day after Thanksgiving. They talk about the dark parts of their history too. This is the drunk dance, or El Borracho, where they're showing symbolically how the Indians were pacified with liquor as part of the narrative of these stories. This is in Albuquerque. They dance where I don't know how many of you know, think about this on Christmas, is that the Comanches were in Palestine at the time, and they come to Jesus, and in this particular ritual, all the Indians have to give to Jesus is a dance. And they sing a really interesting dance. I won't sing it to you, but the verses are in Spanish, and the chorus is Native American vocables where they're singing nani yani ye, nani yani ye. So it's that, once again, that cultural hybridity in New Mexico. This dance originally came from communities west of Albuquerque, which were buffers between raiding Navajos and Albuquerque proper. And they're dancing. And this one, it just happens in houses they find. And the most dangerous job at this ritual is protecting the baby Jesus Christ child. These are the padrinos, because as part of this ritual, the next year's feast will be take place. They'll figure out where it'll take place when the baby Jesus gets kidnapped. So the baby Jesus gets kidnapped to bring him into the Comanche community. This is a sad one for me. This is Eduardo Chavez. They used to dance for Our Lady of Guadalupe in Alameda, which is a barrio in Albuquerque, until they got a new priest, and he said, I don't know what these Mexicans are doing, dancing like Indians for Our Lady of Guadalupe, and he shut it down. So that's Edward and Eduardo Chavez and his wife Priscilla. And that's the last year they were allowed to dance in the church in Alameda. So a lot of this is, it's always a contested space. Suddenly, wow, there's a color picture. This cultural hybridity goes back really deeply. This is a painting by Charles Catlin. This would have been done before the invention of photography. Charles Catlin was an anthropologist and artist who went out and actually went to the Comanche villages in West Texas primarily, the raiders who came to New Mexico. And this is one of his most famous portraits. This guy is named Josue Sanchi. And you go, Josue Sanchi. And it's really actually Jose Sanchez. And we've been able to track, he was called the Little Spaniard, and he was one of the, at the period of Catlin, he was considered one of the bravest Comanche chiefs. Well, historians have found that Josue Sanchi was actually a cautiva. He was from Taos. He was kidnapped in Taos, New Mexico as a small child, and they brought him in. One of the things Catlin writes about is that the Comanches, although they call themselves Namana, the Comanches, when Catlin first went into the village, everyone was speaking Spanish. Why is that? Because that was the lingua franca of the time, and that's how the cautivos and everybody was able to communicate within the Comanche community. About 5 years ago, I went to a conference, and the governor of, or the tribal chair of the Comanche Nation was there, and he says, I'm going to greet you in the lingua franca of my people. And he said, Buenos dias. And that connection has remained really strong. I did a book, I think in 2004, 2005, called Hermanitos Comanchitos with my colleague Enrique, Indo-Hispano Rituals of Captivity and Redemption. And when we did the book, LaDonna Harris, who's a really good friend of mine, who's Comanche, and Greg Cajete, who's a Native American Studies director at UNM, said, well, the tribal elders in Lawton, Oklahoma have decided they want you to come and talk to us about your book. And we thought, oh no. So we had to go, and it was really great. I mean, it was really funny. All the Native Americans under 30 hated the idea because they thought the Comanches in New Mexico were going to try to become Comanches. And the older people, it was like, these are our lost brothers in New Mexico. So that was really quite remarkable. This is the cover, the picture that's on the cover of my book, my new book, Nación Genízara. And it's essays that are about all different parts of Native American, Hispanic, Genízaro ritual and family stories. My sister, who's sort of the family historian in my family, found that we had a dark history on both sides of my family. The Gandert name, which is not Hispanic, I always thought it was until I went to my first Chicano Studies conference, because all the Ganderts I know came from a little small town in northern New Mexico. It's actually German, from the first guy who came here, William Friedrich, who lived in northern New Mexico. And we found out through my sister's workings that he had a Ute slave. So he came down the Santa Fe Trail. Originally, he was from Germany, I think Hanover. And then he came down Santa Fe Trail, settled in Taos briefly as a merchant, and then came across to the Mora Valley, where my family's kind of homeland is. But she writes a chapter where the first Gandert had a Ute slave, and then my mom is the descendant directly of a cautiva. My mom's grandmother was sold to a family in Antonito, Colorado, and slavery is slightly different in New Mexico. You could only remain a slave for 12 years, and then you would get your freedom, and that's what happened to a lot of Genízaros who went out to the frontier. And the other part of it is my great-grandmother ended up marrying the youngest son of the family that had owned her. So it's an interesting book as we re-examine history under the context of this idea of the importance of understanding slavery in New Mexico, and then the Hispanic Native American connection that's much stronger than what we would think based on this. And that's why I think, the whole notion of the tricultural myth has been really broken in these. I could give you other rituals about which I have a show opening on Friday at the Museum of Fine Arts in Santa Fe. It has to do with penitentes, which is a controversially now written as by a guy named Ramon Gutierrez as a Native American cult, which is that even though we think of it as traditional northern New Mexico Hispanic tradition, it's really about these Genízaros and Hispanicized Indians. And one of the things that's exciting is this newfound authority with Genízaros is really bringing people back to these traditions. And I was lucky enough to find out that in a little village outside of Albuquerque, in what's called the Tijeras Canyon, which is the canyon, it's a narrow pass that comes from the Great Plains into Albuquerque. And there was a Genízaro community there called Carnuel. And Carnuel would have been the buffer between Albuquerque proper and the Comanches. And they've started the Comanche ritual again. And I was lucky enough to be there for the first year. This is the cross from the Morada, the Penitente Chapel. And these are some penitentes in pilgrimage. And it was kind of strange because the first time they wanted to do it, they wanted to do it at one of their old village sites, which happened to be a white guy's driveway. There had been a chapel there, that had been gone for years and years and years. But that's where they decided they had to start as they revitalized this ritual in the community. So they brought the penitentes, they brought people from the community. Here the penitentes on the road right before they get to the man's house are praying. You can see the iPhones there. I love everyone's photographing now. It's great. And there they are. These are hermanos from the penitentes in Carnuel, blessing the Cristo. They are dancing. They they dance primarily with a drum and people singing. And the dances and the lyrics, and this is kind of touching. The dances that they're doing come out of the book that Enrique and I did that I talked about earlier, Hermanitos Comanchitos. So Enrique is world-renowned ethnomusicologist, and so we have all of the dances, patterns, and songs in that book, and they're carrying it around like a Bible. But it's really quite exciting. And the amount of the Carnival is not a big community, so to have these people all here is really exciting. It's really exciting. And it was cold. It was awfully cold. But they're dancing, and there's a new generation you can see that's learning to dance. And I'm going to go photograph this Saturday in a community called Atrisco. They've revitalized the dance, and people are really openly embracing and acknowledging this indigenous slave heritage. That young man has an eagle feather on, and that would be considered illegal because he's not Native American, he's Hispanic, but it's a kind of an act of defiance. This is one of the main figures revitalizing the dance. He's also the co-editor of the book Nación Genízaro. He's an architecture professor at UNM who grew up in this community, Carnuel, and he's really gone a long way, not just acknowledging and soliciting the scholarship for this book, but also, performing and bringing it back into the community where it's felt to be so important right now. This is him and his son. It's kind of my favorite picture in the group. And it's just beautiful. And they've been dancing now every year. They also, it's really interesting because Carnuel also has a really strong Matachines tradition. And you can rent Matachines. And Carnuel has been dancing in Albuquerque since probably, I don't know, when I started photographing him in the 80s. And now they're starting to take their Comanche group, which is getting stronger yearly, to other communities that feel like they need it. And they helped found the group in Atrisco. And the thing about this that makes me so hopeful is traditions come, traditions go, traditions die. But the young people are really getting into it. And it acknowledges a sort of context for a very, very specific heritage of these people and our communities. And so I'm just really proud that the young people are there and they're dancing. This is prior to the start of the dance that happened in Carnuel. And it's just, there's a new generation, and we just hope that 50 years from now, they'll be dancing still. And with that, I'm just ready to take questions. Does anybody have any questions, or I don't know?
Thank you, Miguel. This is Sandy. I'm glad you mentioned the new generation at the end, because I was struck by how many of your pictures have little kids in them. Sometimes the little children seem to be, the youngsters seem to be dancing. Sometimes they're just there. But so many of them do have, so many of your photographs have the kids. And of course, they are the future. So as you say, we hope that everybody will still be dancing 50 years from now. Actually, my question has to do with gender. And it looked to me like there were some of the rituals where women took part and danced, but it seemed to be pretty dominated by the men. It seems to be a fairly masculine activity. Am I wrong?
That's something that's problematic and is starting to be contested. In Alcalde, for example, there was a group of women dancers, and they're still there, but yet the community still hasn't empowered them to be a part of the community. And I photographed the women dancers. They call themselves the rainbow dancers.
Well,
And
I didn't know how to turn that off. I'll do that later.
and the rainbow dancers weren't allowed to dance at the church. So I photographed them dancing at a gas station. And it's still, you know, it's still a very sexist. The Comanches de la Sierra, de la Serna, they're mixed, they're male and female. Very few Matachines. The Malinches are primarily the only female figures. They have cross-gender. They have what are called perihundias, where they have men dressed in women's clothing dancing. But primarily it is a problem. The Penitente Brotherhood that I talked about a little bit, they're finally starting to, some of the communities are incorporating women in ways that they hadn't before, but still in the major Penitente, strengthening places like Abiquiu, the women are still there to serve, there to make food, you know, there to not be a part of the dance. But in the west side of the state, I know in a couple of small communities, women are being integrated into the penitente rituals. So it is happening. It's happening slowly, but it's primarily been a patriarchal European cultural model. The Pueblos, which are really interesting because they're matrilineal as opposed to patriarchal, but still the men primarily do the dance. And I suspect it's kind of an interesting thing. If you ever talk to a lot of Pueblo Indians, and I have a lot of friends, it's never my dad's house. It's never, well, you can come over to my grandma's and eat. I'll go up to Jemez and it's like, let's go to my mom's and eat. Let's go, and it'll be the woman, or let's go to my house and eat, and it'll be the woman, because primarily the women own the house and the men sort of were there to govern. And matrilineal is how Native Americans trace their heritage. For example, one of my closest friends at Picuris Pueblo is named Cat or Carl Sosi. And if you're from New Mexico, everybody pretty much knows that Sosi's a Navajo or a Dene name. And why is he Picuris and not Navajo? It's because it's matrilineal. And matrilineal line goes through the mother, and she's a Jaramillo. And so therefore he self-identifies as Picuris. Younger generation are now starting to self-identify with both. If they're mixed marriage Native American, they'll say, I'm Arapaho Navajo or something. But from the Indian school that was in Santa Fe, that's sort of the historical heritage of Picuris. The women were there going to school and they married Native American men, but Mr. Sosi was Navajo. I have another friend, family that were my next door neighbors growing up who are also identified as Picuris. And they're the Yazis, and Yazi is also a very common Dene Navajo name. But yeah, I mean, it's I think it's changing. It'll change slowly. The Comanches in Carnuel are a mix of women and men. But it's still the men that are primarily the driving force.
So what you're saying is that historically, that the men did the dancing while the women took care of the house. And so that's probably why women are not doing much of the dancing now.
Yeah. Well,
the
Pueblos are much more, I mean, I photographed a lot of the Pueblos with dances, and the women are more prominent in the Pueblo dances than the Hispanic dances. And so that may go back to European heritage, I think. I never really thought about it much, but I think that's partly where it may come from. Pueblo dances, the traditional Pueblo dances, the women and men share a much more equal share of the dance. So if you go, if you go to Jemez, for example, you'll see this is primarily a male-dominated dance on Our Lady of Guadalupe. But if you go to a corn dance or you go to another feast day dance, it'll be very different. And you just wonder if that's the cultural influence of Spain and the Spanish-Mexican culture that settled New Mexico. And in case you're wondering why I use the term Spanish-Mexican, that's the term they actually used. If you go back to the first 1580, when they're first coming to New Mexico, when Juan de Oñate came, and you look at the manifests, they define themselves as Spanish Mexicans. So that's why I use that term. And so I think it might be, this primarily, patrilineal influence on the particular dances we looked at. But the Comanches de la Serna, I would say they're 1/3, 2/3, 1/3 women, 2/3 men. And so, it seems like the more indigenous the dance, maybe the more equitable they are in terms of gender. So, other questions?
Miguel, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Maria.
I
know very little about this. I'm really an Eastern U.S. person. But contemporary life for these people, are they well integrated into the life of New Mexico in terms of the power structure, the recipient of resources and so forth?
Well, the Pueblos, it's kind of an interesting question, because the Pueblos are still separated in a certain sense from the other communities. Are they integrated culturally and socially? Our last two governors, our current governor and our last governor, were both Hispanic women, and one was a Republican and the other's a Democrat. So in terms of integrating with a certain level of power structure, yeah. Native American studies here at UNM, really strong program. They have a master's degree, and a lot of Native scholars coming out of New Mexico. And so, integrated to the degree that they can. I mean, there's horrible problems on the Navajo reservation. There's horrible examples of environmental pollutant in lower income communities, and that includes Pueblos. We've had some really great legislators and politicians who've come from different Native American communities. There's still a power dynamic that is controlled by what we call Anglo here, the dominant white culture. Within the Pueblos, the Pueblos have some political power. Albuquerque has some of the cleanest water in the world. And the reason why it does is it's because it has a Pueblo. The Rio Grande bisects Albuquerque, the river. And the reason why the water here is so clean is because Sandia Pueblo to the north and Isleta Pueblo to the south have much higher than EPA water standards. And so the water that comes into Albuquerque has to go through Sandia Pueblo, and their standard is ceremonially clean water.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then it has to go out again because it goes out through Isleta, and Isleta has the same water law or water standards, and it has to be ceremonially clean when it comes out. This is a really novel thing where sometimes Native American trumps the laws. And water, which is so important in New Mexico, is when we get drought and the water shortage, Native Americans still have first rights to the water. They were the oldest claimants, and they still have that. There's a big controversy that's about to happen in northern New Mexico in the next couple of years with the village that I grew up in, or that my father grew up in, the Mora Valley, where the Mora Valley has two translateral ditches, where they're literally taking water out of the Rio Grande watershed and dropping it into the Mississippi watershed, which the Mora Valley is on. It's on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. And Picuris Pueblo is now filing court cases because that water should have belonged to them. You know, in the 1850s, the cavalry people, while they built these trans-mountain ditches, and now Picuris is using the law that this is their water first, to see if they can close down those trans-mountain ditches. And if that happens, half of the Mora Valley, which was in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s till the railroad came, the wheat basket of New Mexico will essentially dry up half of the valley. And so, you know, the laws sometimes help Native Americans. The joke at Abiquiu, where they all say they're Geniceros, is they made a choice, I think in 1920. No, I think it was before that, in territorial time. They made a choice to become a Hispanic village instead of a pueblo because the U.S. government couldn't figure out who they were. And sometimes they say, wow, we should have, you know, instead of just having O'Keefe be famous in Abiquiu, we should have said we were a pueblo, because then we could have a casino. I mean, if you go through New Mexico, there's casinos. Every Native American community, or a lot of them, have casinos because they can do that and nobody else can. They've actually bought the two northern racetracks as casinos. So once the state fairgrounds in Albuquerque and Santa Fe Downs, which no longer races horses in Santa Fe, are now owned by Native Americans. It becomes their land and they can gamble right there in town. You know, so but integration, I mean, there's still a level of racism. One of the challenges at the university is competing for resources. You know, we've tried to form as strong partnerships with Chicano Studies, with our colleagues in Native American Studies and Black Studies, because we found that our institution, as much as you wish it were a more enlightened place, was always playing us against each other for resources, which is a real common thing. The Native Americans, there's a great book written by a scholar, his last name's Frank, I can't think of his first name, about pre-colonial times. And he talks about vecino culture, that the Hispanic villages and the Native American pueblos were much more closely linked. When the Comanches attacked Taos, all of the settlers went into Taos Pueblo because it was more defendable. You know, there's been this relationship. Generally speaking, prior to, I don't know, territorial times, if you were going to have your child baptized, and let's say you were in Picuris and you were Picuris Indian, the padrinos, the baptism would probably been from Vadito, a little community right next to Picuris. They're very close. The same thing would happen the other way, where if you had a Hispanic family that was bordering with a pueblo, the godparents. So that there's always been these things, but whenever you create third, fourth, fifth power dynamics, everybody's trying to get at resources. There were a lot of northern New Mexico land grants. If they had been able to keep the land grants, there wouldn't have been much land for Anglo settlers. So the laws were manipulated. The Pueblos get to keep their land and have won some cases. They got a sacred lake back for Taos Pueblo. And most of the Forest Service land in New Mexico was all was Hispanic land grants, who were had the land stolen by fraud. And a guy named Tom Catron, who at one point was the Attorney General of the state of New Mexico and was the biggest single landowner in the lower 48 states. And all of the land he stole was from Hispanic families. So it's still a struggle. I mean, integrated. I grew up. My next door neighbors. I thought everybody in the United States grew up this way. Just talk about being intercultural. I had my house where my dad and my family lived. 139 Alamo Drive, 141 Alamo Drive. My neighbors were from Picuris Pueblo, and 137 Alamo Drive was the managing editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican, who was an Oklahoman, like Tony Hillerman, had come to Santa Fe actually with Tony, or Tony had brought him when Tony was the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican. So, and I thought everybody grew up that way, but, little did I know the unique situation. But they're still kind of, the Yazas, who still live next door to my family in Santa Fe, we bought our house. They still rent because for the longest time, nobody would give Native Americans in New Mexico a mortgage. They probably paid for that house 10 times, but until my friend Dennis and Stanley and Wayne, till their mom dies, they'll probably keep that in the house in Santa Fe because that's their mom's house, and that's what it means, mom's house. Other questions, comments? I hope that was too long an answer.
No, fine. Interesting.
Yeah. This is my home, and I look at it very carefully and very critically, and yet I don't ever want to leave and move. I mean, my biggest move will be from Santa Fe, Albuquerque to Santa Fe. I mean, I photographed all over Latin America, and I could go other places. But I think, anytime you have indigenous people acknowledged as indigenous people, this country is just have problems with fairness. Which is why I think the whole notion of Genízaro was denied for so long. That, when you think 70% of all northern New Mexican multi-generational Hispanics have Indian blood in them, and probably as much as some of the Pueblo people have.
Miguel, this is Sandy. I would like to thank you for this. It was a feast for the eyes, and it certainly, for me, has added a dimension to the holidays. I have, of course, my own family rituals of the certain kinds of baking and decorating the house and bringing in Christmas carols and that sort of thing. But I had never really considered that it was a time for dancing, special dancing, special rituals having to do with history. Because that's really what you have described today to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for doing the webinar for us.
Thank you. And just as a closing note, these dances really happened because of the Native American influence, because there is a whole midwinter, just as well as there's a midsummer dance cycle within the Pueblo culture, and that was so important. And so when the Spanish came here, they just co-opted sometimes the time period from the indigenous people, because it became a time to dance. And whenever a Saint's Day corresponds to those things, boy, it gets even bigger. At San Juan Pueblo, they dance for John the Baptist, and they bless the river. And almost always that's when the monsoons start, you know, and so there's also a summer cycle of these dances. But I think the proximity to the birth of Christ has made the winter celebrations probably the most dramatic. You know, you could go on Christmas Day, they're dancing at almost all of the pueblos. Santo Domingo is fantastic. They have these little hobby horses they wear. And if anybody asks you about why they don't let you photograph at the pueblos, for the pueblos, the dances are so sacred that they don't want distractions. They don't have drawing pads. They don't let iPhones. They don't want to see anything. You are supposed to focus, and that's why they welcome you, is that you have such good energy that, you know, you can be with them. So welcome all of these communities that I've shown you. Everybody's welcome. In Las Cruces, if you go down to Tortugas, they're famous for their meatballs and gravy and red chili. They call them albondigas. I die for the Comanches de la Serna. There's one house that they always dance at and has the best empanaditas, little turnovers that I've ever had, except for my mom's. And, you know, so thank you for being in. I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday.
Thank you again, Miguel.
Thank you.
Yeah.